I am the woman caught in adultery, and this is my story. The rough fabric of my tunic ripped as heavy, calloused hands slammed me against the stone wall. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs, leaving a bitter taste of dust and copper in my mouth. Voices, loud, jagged, and dripping with malicious triumph, shattered the quiet of the morning. We caught her in the very act. The words were stones, before the actual stones could even be gathered. Shame, hot and suffocating, flooded my chest as I was dragged naked and trembling into the blinding light of the street. The dust of Jerusalem's narrow alleys clung to my damp skin, a physical brand of my disgrace. Just moments before, the room had been dark, a sanctuary of whispered promises and hidden shadows. Now, the world was a chaotic blur of accusing eyes pointing fingers and the relentless, crushing weight of public exposure. I tried to pull the remnants of my torn robe around my body, but a violent yank from one of my captors tore it away, leaving me exposed to the cold morning air and the merciless gazes of gathering onlookers. The men who held me were not strangers. They were the pillars of our community, the scribes and Pharisees, whose long tassels and broad phylacteries signaled a righteousness I could never hope to attain. Their grips on my wrists were like iron manacles, bruising the flesh as they dragged me forward. I stumbled, my bare feet scraping against the sharp, uneven cobblestones, leaving faint smudges of blood in our wake. Every step was an agony of humiliation. Neighbors I had known for years turned their faces away in disgust, while others joined the growing procession, their whispers swelling into a deafening roar of condemnation. "To the temple!" one of my captors shouted, his voice vibrating with a disturbing kind of joy. "Let the law of Moses be answered." I knew what that law demanded. I had heard it spoken of in hushed, fearful tones since I was a child. For a sin like mine, the penalty was death, not a swift, merciful end, but a slow, brutal execution by stoning. The image of sharp, heavy rocks shattering my bones flashed through my mind, sending a wave of pure terror through my veins. My knees buckled, but they dragged me onward, my body scraping along the dirt, until someone pulled me up by my hair, forcing me to walk. I closed my eyes, wishing the earth would open up and swallow me whole, wishing I could disappear into the dust. We crossed the threshold into the massive, sun-drenched outer courtyard of the temple, the court of the Gentiles. The air here was thick with the scent of burning incense, roasting sacrificial meats, and the heavy musk of livestock. Hundreds of people were gathered, creating a sea of cloaks, turbans, and murmuring voices. The crowd parted like water before a storm as my captors marched me into the center of the court. They threw me forward. I collapsed onto the smooth, polished marble tiles, my hands and knees absorbing the hard impact. I lay there curled into a defensive ball, shivering despite the heat of the rising sun. I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, staring at the intricate patterns of the stone floor, unable to bear the weight of the hundreds of eyes boring into me. The silence that fell over the courtyard was heavy, expectant, and suffocating. "Teacher!" The voice of the lead Pharisee boomed across the courtyard, cutting through the stillness like a trumpet blast. I carefully shifted my gaze upward just an inch, tracking the hem of his pristine white robe. "This woman was caught in the very act of adultery," he announced, his voice dripping with an artificial solemnity that poorly hid his eagerness. "Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say?" Only then did I realize they hadn't brought me here just to punish me. I was a pawn, a weapon to be used against someone else. Through the tangled web of my hair, I risked a glance at the man they were addressing. He was seated on a low stone step, surrounded by a circle of people who had been listening to him teach. He didn't look like the religious elites who held my life in their hands. His clothes were simple, the dusty garments of a traveler, woven from coarse, undyed wool. He had no entourage of armed guards, no ostentatious displays of piety. For a long moment, the man did not speak. The silence stretched tightly, vibrating with tension. The Pharisees shifted on their feet, their fingers twitching, eager for a debate, eager for a trap to spring. If this teacher said to let me go, he would be violating the sacred law of Moses, branding himself a heretic and a lawbreaker. If he said to stone me, his reputation as a man of mercy and compassion, a shepherd to the broken, would be shattered instantly. Either way, my life was merely the currency they were using to buy his ruin. I held my breath, waiting for the verdict that would end my life. I braced myself for the sound of an angry command, for the first stone to be lifted. Instead, the teacher did something entirely unexpected. He didn't stand up to face his accusers. He didn't argue, nor did he look at me with the disgust I had grown to expect from every face in Jerusalem. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward. He bent down toward the polished marble floor, lowered his hand, and began to write in the dust with his finger. The movement was so calm, so utterly unbothered by the fury surrounding him, that a strange hush fell over the immediate crowd. The Pharisees looked at one another, confusion momentarily flickering across their stern faces, replaced quickly by irritation. "Teacher, do you hear us?" the leader demanded, stepping closer, his voice sharpening. "The law is clear. What is your judgment?" The man kept writing. I watched the movement of his hand, tracking the line his finger traced through the thin layer of desert dust that had blown across the courtyard. I couldn't see what he was writing, but the sheer, deliberate nature of the act felt like a shield placed between me and the wolves. He was drawing their attention away from my exposed, trembling form and fixing it onto the ground. They continued pressuring him, their questions turning into a barrage of demands. They demanded an answer, growing louder, more aggressive, stepping into his space. Finally, the teacher stopped. He straightened up, rising smoothly from his seated position to stand at his full height. He didn't look angry. His face carried a profound, sorrowful gravity that seemed to quiet the air around him. He looked past the furious religious leaders and scanned the crowd, before finally letting his eyes rest upon the men who had dragged me there. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a shout, yet it carried an incredible, resonant authority that echoed off the high stone walls of the temple. "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." The words felt like a physical blow, shifting the entire atmosphere of the courtyard in an instant. It was as if a mirror had suddenly been shattered in front of every man standing there. The trap they had meticulously laid for him had snapped shut, but its teeth were wrapped around their own ankles. Without waiting for a response, the teacher calmly stooped down again. He returned to the dust, bending over the floor, and began to write once more. An absolute heavy silence blanketed the courtyard. The aggressive energy that had fueled the mob evaporated, replaced by a sudden, freezing stillness. I remained on the floor, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for someone to reject his words, waiting for a rock to fly. But no rock flew. Instead, a sound broke the silence, the dull, heavy thud of a large stone slipping from a hand and hitting the dirt. I tilted my head slightly. The oldest Pharisee, a man whose gray beard and deeply lined face usually commanded absolute deference, was staring at the ground where the teacher was writing. His face had gone pale, his posture deflated. Without saying a word, he turned his back, pulled his cloak tightly around his shoulders, and walked away, his sandals clicking softly against the stone. Then came another thud, and another. One by one, the men who had held me so violently, the men who had shouted for my blood, began to drop their weapons. The younger men looked to the elders, seeing their retreat and found their own confidence dissolving. The heavy rocks they had gathered with such righteous enthusiasm were abandoned, rolling uselessly across the smooth floor. I watched the hems of their fine robes turn away. The circle of accusers shrank step by step, person by person. The crowd that had gathered to witness the execution began to disperse, melting back into the shadows of the temple colonnades, their whispers now hushed and subdued. The suffocating weight of their condemnation lifted, leaving behind a vacuum of profound quiet. I closed my eyes, a single tear cutting a clean path through the dirt on my cheek. The immediate danger of the stones was gone, but the raw vulnerability remained. I was still ruined. I was still the woman caught in adultery. The teacher stopped writing. He stood up once more, the rustle of his coarse garments the only sound in the vast space. I felt his presence approach me. I braced myself, tightening my muscles, expecting the lecture, the stern rebuke, the look of righteous disapproval that would seal my internal shame even if my physical life had been spared. "Woman," his voice was gentle, carrying a deep warmth that I had never heard from any man, let alone a religious teacher. "Where are those, thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee?" Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up from the cold floor, using my torn robe to cover myself as best I could. I lifted my head and looked around the courtyard. The space where a dozen angry, stone-wielding men had stood just moments ago was completely empty. The abandoned stones lay scattered in the dust like harmless pebbles. I looked at him fully for the first time. His eyes were not cold or analytical. They didn't view me as an object of sin or a point in a theological debate. They looked at me with an intense, profound recognition, as if he knew every pain, every mistake, and every broken piece of my heart, and chose to look anyway. "No man, Lord," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely audible even to myself. He looked at me, a soft, reassuring smile gracing his features. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no fine print to his mercy. "Neither do I condemn thee," he said, his words breaking the final chains of the heavy shame that had threatened to suffocate me. "Go, and sin no more." The command wasn't a threat, it was a gift. It was the granting of a future I thought had been permanently stolen from me 5 minutes ago. He wasn't minimizing what I had done, nor was he leaving me in the dirt of my past. He was handing me a clean slate, a path forward, and the dignity of a second chance. I stood up on steadying legs, pulling the cloth around me, no longer feeling like a condemned criminal waiting for execution, but like a person who had been pulled from the depths of the grave. I turned and walked out of the temple courts into the sunlight of a brand new morning, leaving the stones and my old life behind in the dust.